everyone. Welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in controlling groups, also known as cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left. As some of you may have picked up on already, I am not Dhyana, who is the regular host of this podcast. Some of you may already know who I am, but for those of you who do not know, my name is Ashlen Hilliard. I was Dhyana's classmate in the Psychology of Coercive Control program. And on the side, I am a consultant who helps family members with loved ones and groups understand cult involvement. I also co-organize a local meetup in Portland, Oregon called the Spiritual Abuse Forum for Education for Survivors of Groups. You are all in for a real treat today as we get to dive into Dhyana's story and get to know the host behind the podcast. I feel very honored to be here with Dhyana today and to guide her through her experiences. So Dhyana, thank you for allowing me to interview you today, and welcome on.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Of course. It's probably interesting to be on the other side.
Definitely.
The microphone, so to speak. And before we jump into your story, I'm curious to know your thoughts, or perhaps maybe even fears, about sharing your story on the Generation Cult podcast that you created.
Yeah. I actually have a really hard time talking about my own story. I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons behind this, but I do feel like I feel like everyone's going to be mad at me when I talk about my group. I guess to a certain extent, I do feel like the people I was raised with, I guess I still care what they think. And, there's always in the back of my mind, like, oh, I'm going to be in so much trouble. They're going to be so mad at me, because it was always something you weren't really supposed to talk about. And I think even though rationally I know that I can talk about it, there's this emotional side of me that's like, alert, stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like we sometimes put a lot of pressure on ourselves to really concisely tell our story, to make sure that we highlight certain things and not others, especially when you do anything that's media related.
Yeah.
And I want to take that pressure off with you today, as much as possible, at least, and to just have a conversation where I am learning for the first time a little bit about your experience, which is actually true. This will be my first time actually speaking with you about your time being in a group. I think it's really cool that this has kind of come full circle. We first met in Manchester at a ICSA conference, actually, a few years ago. It was probably like 2019 or something.
Yeah.
But even then, that was several years ago. But that was the first time that we connected. So I find it just to be such an honor to be here discussing with you. I kind of want to begin by just looking very big picture. Give me a snapshot. Where exactly did you grow up? Did you grow up in a large family, a small family? What was the group that you were involved in?
Yeah, I grew up in a small family. It was my mom, my dad, my sister, and I. This all took place in Santa Barbara, California, which is a really pretty city. It was a commune. The group that I was in had a commune, probably about 100 people total at its height. And we studied something called theosophy, which I found very hard to define. I mean, depending on who you ask, it's kind of meant to connect between the East and the West. Theosophy means divine wisdom. So it's kind of based on this concept that there's this divine wisdom that everyone's trying to have. And there are these great teachers out there who are supposed to help us find this divine wisdom. Theosophists also believe in reincarnation. So your soul is reincarnated. Also, the concept of universal brotherhood. You are supposed to promote social improvement. So those were kind of the basics behind the ideology. There are a lot of theosophical societies around the world. My group came about because there was another group that branched off called the United Lodge of Theosophists, and that started in LA. And then the group I was in was kind of a branch of that broke off from the LA group. and was a group in Santa Barbara. And we ended up having our own charismatic, controlling leader. And so I felt like we were somewhat isolated from other theosophists. I didn't even know much about any other theosophists at the time, really.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating the way in which you're describing theosophy, where it's like you mentioned, this East meets West. It's this bridge. When you're describing this, I'm kind of thinking about unity and a lot of these concepts. And it really sounds like it could be something that has to do a lot with internal experience. When you mentioned divine wisdom, and perhaps the experience of theosophy could be different to everyone involved in theosophy. And maybe that's why there's such an unclear definition. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
No, you're not wrong at all. In fact, when I first decided to start delving in and researching the group I grew up in, I started tracking down and interviewing people who were adults when I was a kid at the time. And then I interviewed some of my friends who I grew up with. And I started each interview by saying, how do you define theosophy? And everyone had a wildly different answer.
that's fascinating.
So, for whatever that's
Yeah,
worth.
that's very interesting. And you mentioned that this particular group, you kind of came from a branch of a branch, right?
Yes.
And I understand a lot about branches of groups and sects and throughout even just US history, if we're just looking at US based groups, but you were kind of isolated, it sounds like, from the greater community of a whole of theosophists. I mean, what made this branch off unique? You mentioned the United Lodge. What made this branch off different? What were they striving for?
I'm not sure what the end goal was. I know that at a certain point it got very unhealthy because of the charismatic leader. There was a man named Raghavan, a very brilliant man who authored books. He was a professor, and the whole thing started to kind of revolve around him. So I guess if I was to say what made it unique, I would say Raghavan,
Okay.
because he kind of ran the show.
Okay. And describe Raghavan to me. Was this person, when I think of commune settings, what stereotypically comes to mind is someone who's dressed like the Bhagwan, who, from Rajneesh Pure. Like it's a very almost mythical Eastern character in the robes and the long beard. That is a very stereotypical version that comes to mind. Was that your experience with Raghavan, or was it very different?
No, not really. I mean, he didn't wear robes or anything. None of us really wore anything that made us stand out. I mean, honestly, it just looked like a bunch of properties that we lived on, and we were just people in them. And like none of us, as far as I know, none of us looked different, including Raghavan. He just, he was an Indian man with longer dark hair, very stern looking. I actually only met him several times. He didn't interact much with the children. He didn't really want to deal with us, but I did see him a few times. And yeah, I don't think he fits the stereotype in the dress, but I do feel like he kind of just fits right in with all the other descriptions of cult leaders that get full of themselves and kind of start taking advantage.
Sure. And it's interesting when we think of communes. I've heard you describe before that your commune was a pretty mellow commune. And I actually love that description. There are so many different kinds of communes. There's different portrayals of communes. I knew someone who was involved in a high intensity Christian cult that was living communally. They basically bought homes on an entire street block, for example, and that was kind of their version of a commune. So I think it's really interesting to kind of break these down so that we kind of move from just this one picture and portrayal of what a commune is and this sort of really sort of intense end of the scale when it comes to communes of, just no privacy at all. You were communally living, it sounded like it was about 100 people. When you say it was a mellow commune, maybe this is a funny question, but what were the vibes of the commune? Like, did you feel the sort of hippies? Okay.
It's definitely like a hippie commune, but not the kind of hippie commune you'd think. I mean, people, when I say, I grew up in a commune, people picture like tents and like a bunch of beds and everyone sleeping in the same room.
Privacy.
Yeah, it really wasn't like that. It was properties. We probably at a certain point had 7 different properties in Santa Barbara, and some of them were just right in downtown Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were just properties and we lived next to each other. Some people shared houses. We moved around a lot within the communes, which was kind of odd. I was told that our leader would just decide each year where he wanted us each to live and plan that out. I don't have any exact proof of that, but that is something I've heard from someone. But anyway, we moved around a lot to different apartments within these properties. But honestly, even if you came over to the house, you wouldn't have really been able to tell that they were communes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and I think it's important to mention these experiences and what the different ways in which communes can look like. So you were born and raised in this group.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to familial involvement, are you a second generation? Are you a multi-generation? What was sort of your path and upbringing into this sort of environment?
Yeah, no, I'm a second generation SGA. My dad was raised in a Jewish family and my mom was raised in a Christian family. They're from Syracuse, New York. They ended up coming out to California a little bit before that. Before they got to California, my sister was born. She was severely disabled and needed a lot of assistance. So I don't think this is the main reason, but one reason I think they appreciated living communally was because people could help them out. There were more people around to help. But yeah, they moved into this commune, and I don't think the communes were even developed until maybe like the early 70s.
Okay. And you grew up in this commune. What time period are we talking? What years were your formative experiences within this group?
I'd say 80s and 90s.
Okay. Because even I imagine that the time period from when the group first started existing to perhaps within the 80s and 90s, perhaps there was changes, maybe not. Sometimes groups can stay very much the same, but maybe over time there was some changes, fluctuations in what your family members experienced versus what you experienced. I'm curious as to if you know anything about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of changes. There was some weird drama that I didn't understand as a kid. In the last 5-6 years, I've actually kind of dug up information about it, interviewed people, I've dug up newspaper articles because there were some newspaper articles written about us.
Yeah.
And, things kind of fell apart. People started not liking our leader. They started feeling like they were being misled or taken advantage of. Some information came out about affairs. And there became this like huge split within the group. And there were people who were like, no, we don't want to follow Raghavan anymore. And then there was another group of people who were like, no, he's the great teacher.
Right.
And so those people who continued to support him, they moved off and formed their own commune. And then I kind of feel like I hovered in the middle because we stayed on one of the communes. We didn't have a lot of money, so I assume it was probably a financial thing.
Yeah.
We were still kind of involved, but it was really confusing. So that was the big change. When the newspaper articles came out, it was because people had donated their property. Like that's where these communes came from. They were properties in Santa Barbara owned by people. You can only imagine how much that's worth today.
Right.
And some people felt like they were basically coerced into signing their properties over. So there was a lawsuit, and that's how the articles started, talking about the lawsuit and, some accusations people had about the group. So that was some of the drama.
So was this drama, was that unfolding during your time in the group, or was that pre your time? Like, was that during your parents' time or while you were?
Mine. Okay. I was a kid.
Wow.
It was the weirdest thing because I grew up with all these, with these people around me. We weren't completely isolated. I mean, obviously we were right in Santa Barbara. I even went to public school, but I think I felt like I kind of stuck within the group. But it's not like we were completely cut off. So there's all these people you're used to having around your entire life. And then all of a sudden people just start disappearing. Like they're just gone. Yeah. At first it was like no one would tell me why. Like, why have these people all of a sudden disappeared? Then it was like, oh, well, we don't talk to these people anymore. We don't really interact with these people anymore. And then And then I heard that these like horrific articles came out that were terrible.
Right.
I certainly wasn't shown them, but it was like, oh, they were so bad. I can't believe someone wrote a story about us. It was so awful. And that kind of marked the beginning of the end to me, because that's when it all started to kind of go downhill.
Right. So you knew that there was some sort of unusual things happening, within the commune, within your own life, with people just sort of uprooting. What age were you when you really started to put some of these pieces together?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, because I feel like I started noticing something was a little off when I was like 9 or 10. My friends and I would talk about it. We'd be like, oh, well, this is weird. And it's like we interacted with other kids, like in public
Yeah,
school, like we knew how we were living was a bit different. And there was also this kind of secrecy involved. Like for some reason, we couldn't talk about it to other people. So that itself was kind of weird. I don't know if that struck me as weird at the time. I just knew I couldn't really talk about it.
so you were talking to friends about it.
Yeah, my friends within the group, we'd be like, this is weird. And we always thought our parents' devotion to Ragavan was really strange. Some of my friends' parents would just be gone all the time because they just constantly worked on his house for free or other projects for him. So people were constantly doing unpaid labor. And like, as children, you just think like, oh, my parent isn't there. What's going on? And you're upset about it. You don't think, I don't know, this is for the greater good or whatever it is they wanted us to think.
Sure.
So, we definitely noticed something was off. But yeah, when those articles came out, I was probably 13 or 14 maybe. And that was like, I don't know, that was like for some reason like proof that something weird was going on, because it was like the real world, the outside world had acknowledged it.
Sure.
And even though I didn't see the articles at the time, it still kind of struck me as like, okay, now the outside world is getting involved. And then once all the turmoil happened, the people moving away, I started finding out more and more, and then it just kind of became more real.
I can only imagine how unusual that is. How many 13-year-olds have to sort of learn and face these sorts of challenges like you did yourself? How did this unfolding and this realization, this sort of reckoning that the community was facing with the public, how did that affect you as a 13-year-old at that time?
I was a pretty unhappy 13-year-old. I mean, I'm not sure how many people actually are happy when they're 13. That's kind of a tumultuous age. I know that I was miserable in both places. I was not happy at home, and then I wasn't happy at school. I mean, I was weird. So people weren't exactly nice to me. So like, I guess I just kind of felt like I had this problem. I knew something was going on with my home life, with this group. I didn't totally understand what it was, and I knew I couldn't talk about it with anybody. And then at the same time, I was like trying to be what I considered normal, but it wasn't really going that well.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know how to describe how I was feeling. Probably unhappy and conflicted. And I'm sure there was just a lot of confusion. I didn't take the time to be like, wait, this is a bad situation. I just thought like, oh, there's something wrong with me. This is
Of
all me.
course.
You kind of internalize all of that.
And unfortunately, I'm assuming at that age, we just don't have the tools, when we're still so much under the influence of our parents. And then you're under the influence of this greater community at large in the turmoil that's going on. You probably didn't even know that you had options available to you. And your brain probably wasn't even going to those places.
No.
It's very easy for young people to internalize these experiences and think, oh, is it something that I did? This sort of self-blame, this guilt, this confusion. It's something that I see very often with young people, and it can be very difficult to manage. You mentioned that your parents may have been at least a part of, perhaps were drawn to this group because of your sister, helping your severely disabled sister. And that's really powerful. And that I think a lot of people don't realize, and why I feel like these stories, such as yourselves, are so important to share, is that things that are outside of our control, things that we feel like we need help with, those elements can actually be really attracting to groups who either feel like they can hold the answer, or perhaps they could offer more help, either financially or maybe with just more helping hands, like within your family system. And I just wonder, do you feel like your family received the support they were looking for in the group that kept them there? Or do you feel like perhaps that was their initial entrance and they ended up staying for other reasons?
Well, I think they also entered the group because my dad had taken an interest in theosophy. So it
Hmm.
was the ideology
Sure.
too. But yeah, the helping aspect. I think they did find help. Honestly, I definitely did have some bad experiences in the group and there were some really weird people in it, but overall a lot of the people were lovely. Like they
Sure.
were really nice people who wanted to help and they were helpful. I mean, I think that to a certain extent my parents did get what they were looking for. They needed some support and I'm sure they got it. I'm not sure how much they paid for that support, and I don't mean financially. I mean in like free labor, time, emotional distress. I'm sure that they did pay for it in a way. But to answer your question, yes, people were helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and watching my sister, watching me, whenever we needed something. And I mean that is the thing about groups like this. You say I was raised in a cult and people think it's all just like terrible like horrors, but it's like, well, the reason people get into these groups and stay is because like they're getting something out of it. And in my parents' case, it was community. And a lot of other people from the group I've talked to, that was the same for them. They loved the community.
Yeah. I think it's really important to humanize people involved in these groups, whether they're out now or not, to understand that there was something at one point in time that attracted them. And they could be some really lovely people. And it's tough. It's a tough situation to be in. You mentioned that perhaps your parents paid in other ways with labor or time. I'm curious, even just big picture, how did Ragavan elicit control over group members? How did Ragavan sort of keep this structure in place with the community?
Well, I mean, he was taking advantage of the whole hierarchy that developed, first of all. I mean, there was like an inner circle around him, and those were the people who were like a really big deal. It was like, our own celebrities within the group. Like, those people are close to Ragavan. You better be nice to
Oh,
them. And like
yeah.
people wanted to be in the inner circle. And one way people got into it was donating money
Okay.
or time. And so basically, I mean, he used himself as the prize, I guess. Like if you do this stuff for me, you'll get more attention, you'll get more, I don't know, you'll just get more status within the group. And I think that really affected people. As time went on, he started implementing more rules on our group. I mean, since we were Theosophists, we were all vegetarian, so we weren't allowed to eat meat. There was no alcohol. Like, oh my God, like I never even saw alcohol in anyone's house. It was just
Mhm.
like bad. And then it started applying to people's sex lives. Like all of our parents were required to sleep in separate beds or separate rooms. Meanwhile, which I mean, he was having affairs, so it's like
Yeah.
obviously he didn't really go along with some of his rules. And yeah, it was just I just felt like it was just increasing control over people's day-to-day lives in ways that they might not totally notice, like, oh, okay, so I have to sleep in the separate room, like whatever. Okay, so I can't drink, whatever. But it's like all this stuff starts to build up and build up, all these different rules, and people just find themselves sunk into the whole situation. And I feel like that's what happened.
Yeah. I'm curious as to how people found ways to exercise autonomy, if they had autonomy at all, because Ragavan was sounded like really took control over people's finances,
Hmm.
perhaps the selling of their property, relationships, interfering with who can sleep with who and what room even that they're sleeping in. And of course, it sounds like there was a sort of popularity, which is very common thing that we can see within groups is there's sort of this established hierarchy. What did people feel like? Was there sort of this sense of awe, or were they enamored by being in the presence of Ragavan?
Absolutely. Some of the descriptions that people have given to me of experiencing his lectures, apparently he was a brilliant person. He's deceased now, but
Yeah,
he really was brilliant. Like he was a very
sure.
intelligent person, and he would give these lectures that were just apparently just amazing, and people would just be in awe. And I remember one person describing to me, like, they had been up really late, he had been talking for hours, and she was just staring at him. And as he was talking, she started to see, like, his skin turn blue like Krishna, and there was like a
Mm.
halo kind of around him, and it was like this kind of like spiritual experience. So it was like to the point where people really, really saw him as this like special being.
Yeah. And again, this kind of comes back to this inner experience that people have, this sort of spiritual awakening, so to speak. It's very interesting how it was this sort of mix of theosophy, where again, probably attracts people for many different reasons because the ideas of theosophy is so diverse. I'm just assuming that it could probably attract people from all walks of life for different reasons. They may grasp onto parts of theosophy that they really find interesting or impactful. Is that kind of what you experienced and what you noticed within the community? Were people there for a variety of reasons, or was it more singular?
Oh, I think they were definitely there for a variety of reasons. Yeah, people got different things out of studying theosophy. I don't think there's anything wrong with studying theosophy personally. Study whatever you want. That's cool. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with some of the concepts, but other people got something out of it. As a kid, I didn't really. I was confused most of the time. But so I think people did like that aspect of it. I do think they were also there for the community, to have people around them, to have people with shared interests around them. I think everyone had their own reasons for being there, and those reasons were
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah. And I'm curious because you mentioned that it was sort of reaching when Raghavan was exerting control over different facets of individuals' lives within this community. You mentioned that it can kind of reach a point where it sounded like people would go along, in different stages of their experience. And then perhaps it reached a point where, enough was enough, or maybe it was a breaking point for them or a point of departure from the community. What were some of the things that you noticed? How were people reacting to a very rigorously structured environment?
Like, how are they acting within the group, or how did they act as they were
Yeah, how did
leaving?
they act in conflict with the group as things started to build over time? What were people's sort of responses? I'm thinking about threat responses in particular.
Well, again, I witnessed this as a child, and like I felt like a lot was kind of kept from me at the time. I would go so far as to say that people were like incredibly restrained to almost a fault. Nobody felt safe speaking openly, and so you didn't hear them speak openly, really. So the response, I think, was to shut down and not talk to people. At least as far as I was concerned. So I think that was it. It was either shut down or leave, was kind of the response to it. I think some people were really embarrassed. Some people had been in the group for over 20 years, and then they all of a sudden had this epiphany, like, whoa, this guy isn't the second coming of Krishna. This guy isn't the avatar, the great teacher. Like, I've been duped. And they were embarrassed, and they didn't really want to talk about it with anybody and took off. I was able to connect with the reporter who wrote those stories from a long time ago, and she said people were terrified to talk to her. They thought they
Oh,
were being
wow.
followed, like they were really, really freaked out. And, that made an impression on me. People were scared to say anything. So, I guess there were a lot of responses. I think a lot of people just kept their mouths shut. I think some people left. I think some people were just really, really freaked out. It just like really creeped them out, the
Yeah.
whole situation.
Yeah. Wow. And so there's a lot of fear involved. It sounded like when you were 13 and these things were sort of coming to a surface where you were learning more about the group and you sort of had this concept of there was this outside world and what was going on in the group.
Yeah.
What happened from there? I guess like how old were you when you actually departed from the group? What did that process look like from 13 on?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated because although my family were not pro Raghavan, we also didn't leave. So we were kind of stuck in this middle period. And my dad was still really into theosophy, he still is. And we stayed on one of the properties around other people who stayed. And so it was just this like confusing mess until I turned about 18, and then I just like took off. I
Okay.
just like left my parents' house. I obviously like really needed some freedom, but also, thinking back, it was kind of constricting still being like part of this community, but knowing like it was like common knowledge that there were things that had gone horribly wrong and some people had been hurt. And so I guess it was just like confusion. I was conflicted. I certainly wasn't into it. Like I didn't really want to be part of it anymore. I was sad. I missed my friends. I mean, all of the sudden, some of my like closest friends, their families had moved away, and it was like they were on the other quote unquote side.
Right.
There were sides. So I don't know, just a whole lot of confusion. And then and then I just like the second I could move out of my parents' house after I graduated high school, I did.
Yeah.
And I left the state. I like just bailed.
Yeah. I guess, did you ever feel like maybe it would be easier if you were actually on one side or the other instead of just kind of being in this intermediary witnessing place where you were just kind of seeing people come and go? I can only imagine how difficult of a position that was to be in that place where you just saw people
Yeah.
in and out of your life and you were kind of, your family remained, but you weren't really pro Ragavan. I can only imagine how complicated that was.
It was. I mean, in my mind, I was on the other side. I was on the this is all bullshit. No. So I think at that point, I was pretty not, like, despite living on one of the communes and being forced to go to a few meetings here and there, in my mind, I was over it. I was done. I mean, I don't know how much I really believed in the whole thing to begin with. I mean, you're a kid, you just grow up, it's your life. I do remember being like, what? What are they talking about? And asking questions, and people being like, stop asking questions, you're being annoying. I never was like fully on board. Like, I never was like, this is great. So yeah, to answer your question, like in my mind, I was not a part of it, but my physical body was still there, like
Yeah.
on one of these properties. So
Yeah. It's sort of that physically in, mentally out thing.
exactly.
I know that that's a term so often used within those who have left the Jehovah's Witnesses,
Yes.
for example, but I really think it can apply to so many situations such as this. We talked a lot about sort of turning points. So there was this sort of turning point when you were around 13, when you had this sort of outside world influence. There was another turning point when you were around 18. And I'm sure there was turning points in between that time.
Hmm.
I can only imagine the complexity of that time from 13 to perhaps 18 that you experienced. But I want to kind of touch on perhaps another turning point. When you departed from the group, what was sort of your reconciliation with your past like? Did you pursue recovery resources? What were some things that you were sort of dealing with post group involvement?
I would say a whole lot of denial. I like people to like me, and I found it distressing that I didn't fit in growing up, and I was so intent on just like being a normal person. Like I didn't even really fully understand what I had been raised in or what had happened, and like I just didn't want to deal with it. Like I just wanted to be a normal person. I just wanted to go to college and get my journalism degree, which I did. So I would say I didn't deal with it at all. In fact, I actively avoided it. I would say only in the last 6 or 7 years have I been digging into it, and I'm in my 40s, so
Yeah,
it took a while. So yeah, I think denial, that didn't happen. Let's move on. That didn't happen.
right. And when you were in college, did you still feel different, even though you weren't living in the commune anymore, than perhaps your colleagues?
I felt different in that there were some weird things going on with my family. I didn't really connect it to the commune as much, but I kind of feel like at that point when I was in college, I did feel like I kind of fit in. I don't know, you kind of find your people. I didn't feel that different. Like, I didn't feel that different, but at the same time, I always kind of knew in the back of my mind there was this thing that happened, and anytime someone would get close to it, people ask me about my name. I have a Sanskrit name. People sometimes would ask questions. One time a friend really surprised me by asking some really insightful questions. And I was like, oh my God, what do I do? I don't want to talk about this. Like, I don't want people to know.
Sure.
So I guess between denial and like just hiding it would have been how I dealt with it after leaving.
Yeah. when you were kind of in this denial period, what was it that I guess sort of prompted you to pursue recovery resources? Did you kind of hit like some sort of turning point in which you decided, oh, I guess I need to,
Yeah.
I guess, break out of this denial state?
I never connected any need for recovery to this until recently. Even when I decided to start researching the group I was raised in, I approached it from like the angle of a journalist. I was like, oh, well, I have this interesting thing in my past. For some reason, I'm being a weirdo and I don't want to talk about it, but I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to know, what happened. And so I started talking to people, but like even then I wasn't thinking like I have anything to recover from. I never thought I had anything to recover from. I was just
Sure.
like, well, I just want to find out what happened and it's interesting. And then, I started coming up against some people reacting really strangely to me. I had some people get very angry with me, and that started to kind of, make me wonder. And, I had therapy in the past. My mom died of cancer, and that was really traumatic. So I had therapy, but even in my past therapy sessions, I never brought up the group. I didn't even want to go there.
Yeah.
So again, I didn't think I needed any sort of recovery until God, I would just think really within the last 5 years, I started really delving into like, oh, that explains why I have that reaction to that. Like, oh,
Sure.
that's why I do that.
Yeah.
So just recently.
What has this time of recovery been like? It sounds like you've been finding out new things about yourself. You've been able to reconnect and perhaps look at reasons why you react the way you do to things. And that's very relatable. You started this podcast. What was kind of that journey for you like? Like, what prompted you to start this project in particular?
Well, I think it was prompted almost in a way because of my difficulty talking about my specific group. I fully did intend to write a book. I wasn't sure exactly what the focus was going to be, but I did go and interview all these people, and I'm so grateful that they talked to me and were so honest with me. I'll always appreciate that, and I feel bad that as far as a book form, nothing has really come of it. But while I was gathering this information, I also wanted to look at it in a broader context. And so that's how I got involved with ICSA and started meeting psychologists and sociologists who studied cults. And then I started meeting all these other people who were raised in all these different groups that seemed wildly different than mine. But when I would talk to them, we all kind of had some of the same problems, either within our families or like certain types of anxiety, certain types of like substance abuse. Like, it just related on so many levels. And so I just came to this conclusion that, like, well, my group really isn't that. I guess it's not that it's not interesting, but it's not. I realized I didn't really have much to say about my group. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, it happened, and this kind of thing happens. So I couldn't really find a good focus for what I was writing about. I did try to start incorporating more information about people from other cults into the book, but that just made it scattered. And so I kind of put that project on hold, but I did realize I had hours of just like interviews with people. And I thought about all the great discussions I had with other people who had also grown up in communes and cults. And I was like, wow, like, wouldn't it be great for people to be able to hear these stories? Like, it made an impression on me. And I've always kind of been interested in audio and, radio, although most of my career has been written work. So I thought, it's just so powerful being able to hear these people's voices telling their stories. And so I changed my focus to that. And then I decided to make a podcast about people who grew up in cults. And so that's kind of how I came up with Generation Cult. And I do feel like it's kind of an evolution from my original project, my book that I had wanted to do, because by embarking on that journey, I did learn a lot and it did take me to this place. So it's not like all of that was for nothing. Basically, at this point, it's turned into this
I
podcast.
absolutely love that. And you're doing very, very important work. And it's pretty amazing how your journey has sort of led you to doing this project. I think that that's really exciting and impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, when I think back, you kind of mentioned that you approached at first just recovery very investigatively. You were kind of learning more, and it sounded like some people got angry with you and that sort of,
Oh,
I can only
yeah.
imagine. But I wonder, have you been able to reconnect with anyone who also left the group that maybe you remember as a kid, or what has that been like within the context of your own experience?
It's been interesting. I'm not sure how to describe it. I have reconnected with people, but it's usually pretty brief.
Mhm.
Someone comes out of the woodwork and they want to talk to me and we talk. And then it seems like there's a certain period where I'm like, oh, this person's back in my life again. This is so cool. And then all of a sudden they just like disappear. Like, I don't know if it's because they didn't like the questions I was asking. I don't know if they just decided that I sucked in general or that they just didn't want to think about what happened. The way I look at it now is it's kind of just been a push and pull.
Sure.
Sometimes someone will be like, hey, I heard your podcast. I want to talk to you. And then they'll be like, oh my God, get away from me.
Yeah.
Or just like other variations on that. So it has reconnected me with people, but it's confusing to me.
Yeah.
I don't have any hard feelings. It's, processing this group is a lot to deal with. And I could see how someone like myself asking questions and making you think about it could be uncomfortable and could even maybe cause some problems with the rest of your family if they were involved. So I certainly have sympathy. I'm not like bitter about it, but it's definitely been kind of a strange process where I'll think I'm like on the same page with someone, we're moving along, and all of a sudden they just are like, nope, get away from me, bye.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes we never know what it is we exactly say that may sort of prompt that reaction. For everyone, like you mentioned, their reasons for even getting involved in the first place can be so complex and so individualized. And so the things that perhaps promote some hesitancy on their part may be just different for everybody.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. And since Raghavan has since passed, what is the state of the group currently?
It still exists. Basically, after the whole split back in the 90s, it definitely changed form. I mean, it used to be that the place where we met was always full. And then I actually did go to a lodge meeting. I actually just like went and showed up and went to a talk back in, God, I think it was like 2012 or something. And it was just, there were, I recognized some people. They were the people who still thought Raghavan was the great teacher and had moved to this other commune, but it was just tiny. Like there were just a few people here and there. A lot of the people are quite old now. It wasn't like it was before when I was a kid, when there were just like lots of different kids groups and everything. So it still exists, but it's just like a very like muted version of it.
Interesting. It's amazing how groups change over time, especially when there was this charismatic leader in this case, and they've since passed, how that kind of morphs and how that may still influence people. Even after a cult leader or a charismatic leader is deceased, there's still this sense of influence, which is really interesting.
Oh, yeah. And, to a certain extent, it affects me. One of the reasons I hesitate is like, I don't really care what Raghavan would think of me. I mean, to be honest, he probably never really thought of me, but there's still just this like kind of fear that I don't know, piss him off or like make people who like him pissed off at me or something. Like I was definitely affected by something that lingers, and I can't seem to rationalize my way out of it.
I can only imagine that sort of ongoing struggle with someone who really exuded this awe in people, who really prompted such an emotional reaction and reverence. That's probably very challenging, even if you weren't able to be in said inner circle.
Yeah, no, we weren't ever in the inner circle. We never got that honor.
Yeah.
I'm glad now. At the time, though, I felt really bad about it. Like at the time, I was just like, wow, like for some reason, these people are just inherently better than us. I didn't know why. And I think that's a really unhealthy thing for a kid to be raised around. Just growing up knowing that there are people who are they're just better than you, and that's just the way it is, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, at the time, I wished we were part of the inner circle. I wanted to be a big deal in the group. But also, when I hear stories of people who actually got into that inner circle and it was kind of unpleasant for them. So I guess it probably was good that we weren't.
Yeah, it's very interesting and probably really hard as a kid to want that and to want to be seen in that way and to not understand why you weren't seen in that way.
Well, the whole time you're being told over and over and over again, you're having a wonderful childhood.
Right.
You are incredibly lucky to have been born in a body to be in this group.
Right.
So you don't think to really complain, I guess. You're told that this is good.
Well, I think your story is incredibly powerful. We've kind of gone through just a brief journey of you growing up in this group, the periods in which there was conflict, sort of these turning points. Once you departed from the group, how that affected your path into recovery. It first started with just a strong sense of denial into this sort of very investigative mind that you have, which I think is just so wonderful. And here you are now doing Generation Cult, which is an important work. And I wanted to conclude with, what would your hope be for the main takeaway for people? If someone were to stumble across your podcast, if someone were to hear someone's interview on your podcast, what would you hope they would leave with ultimately?
A lot of things. I first of all hope that they would leave with the knowledge that people go through things. Like, it doesn't even, I mean, whether they were raised in a cult or not, people go through things. And when you're going through a trauma, you tend to feel like you're alone, you're the only one. And the reason I thought it was so important to share these other people's stories was because I wanted other people to hear and be like, oh, something like that happened to me, or I relate to that in some way. And I just remember thinking, when I did just have those conversations with other people who were raised in cults, being like, oh, I wish I had known this. I wish I had known that this kind of thing happens, and almost even follows a script to a certain extent. So I want people who come across the podcast to understand that this happens. People grow up in cults. People end up being affected by someone who's really controlling. And if it happens to you, it doesn't mean that you're a weirdo or that there's anything wrong with you. You're not alone. And also, I also really want people to know that there are resources out there to help them. You can reach out for help. There are people who understand. Like, yes, there are always going to be people who are like, ugh, people have been in cults, I'm scared, whatever stereotype is out there. There's always going to be those people. But I think that there's more knowledge out there about like the dynamics of these groups and the control that happens. And I guess I just really hope that my podcast would help people feel less ashamed for going through something similar.
Wow. I so appreciate you sharing your story today with me, Dhyana. I think that this is excellent work that you're doing with this podcast.
Thanks for your help.
Of course. I know for me, it is really impactful to hear other people's stories, because we do find out that we're a lot more similar than we maybe assume at first. Even though we came from vastly different backgrounds, people can find connection and unity and similarity with other survivors. And I feel like that within itself can just be so healing for those who've left coercively controlling groups. I really felt like when you talked about denial, when you mentioned that you just kind of got the hell out of there, and you went to college and you just wanted to keep living, the denial piece was very interesting to me. That stuck out.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. And I think it's something that a lot of people deal with as well. Maybe not in the exact same way I did, but I mean, I also think that shame is a big part of it.
Yeah.
They feel bad about like, why wasn't I involved in this for so long?
Yeah.
Or even, someone like us who grew up in it, like we didn't have a choice, but for whatever reason, it's kind of embarrassing. Oh, I don't want people to know I grew up that way. And I mean, I know for me personally, probably shame was part of my denial.
That's interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I felt like when you were talking about your story, there was a lot of aspects of sort of the shame that perhaps came up. I don't know if you felt shame because you stayed in the community and watched so many people come and go. I don't know if you felt like that was your fault, or if you had any sort of internalized shame about watching the community sort of unfold around you. I don't know if there was shame involved in you not being in the inner circle, for example. You talked about that with your family. I don't know if you felt like, well, if only I could have been better or have been a better child. You kind of mentioned that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like shame was actually a large part of my life. I was criticized quite a bit for my intelligence, for my weight, for the way I looked. And so there was always some sort of aspect of shame just in me. Like I
Mm,
just was never good enough and I just knew it. And it wasn't even a question. It was like, you're just not good enough. And then, not being in the inner circle, not being part of the upper hierarchy, it was just like, well, yeah, of course. Why would they want anything that involved me to be on this upper level?
yeah.
So I guess to a certain extent, it was just like all kind of shame. I don't think I blamed myself for anything when people left. I think I was just really confused. I was also really confused why we weren't leaving, why we weren't moving off the commune.
Right.
Just thought I'm just kind of crappy person. I'm not sure how that fed into denial. I mean, maybe it was because I was so determined to not be a crappy person. I wanted to be like some other person, like a nice, normal person. And
Yeah.
so I had to kind of go into denial and be like, I didn't experience any of that. That's some other person. So that might have been where some of the denial came from, like maybe hiding in a way.
I feel like when you talked about shame feeding into denial, that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Even though it can be complicated to explain, just that sort of statement, very surface level, can make a lot of sense to me. And I'm assuming this process of not feeling shame, do you still struggle with feeling that sense of shame that you did when you were in the group?
Definitely. I mean, I definitely struggle with insecurities. I definitely feel like I have a more realistic view of myself. I don't think I'm, stupid or unattractive or anything like that. I mean, I do have insecurities sometimes. And I think that there is some lingering shame, now that I'm more open about how I grew up. You Google me and like all the stuff about cults comes up and I'm like, ah!
Yeah.
Okay, or I'll go out, I'll be writing like a freelance article and someone will be like, oh, I looked you up. So cults, huh? It's like,
Oh,
eh.
yeah.
So, I mean, maybe there's some shame involved in that just because I don't know. I just have this fear that people are going to make assumptions about me. So, yeah, there's probably some of that in there. And I think I do feel some shame when I just talk about the group because for whatever reason there's just something ingrained in me that's always like, don't talk about it, don't talk about it. There's some shame that comes from that too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think I'm in a better place than I was as a kid. I definitely feel like I've put my experiences more into context. Obviously going and getting a psychology degree helped a little bit.
Yeah, I can only imagine how much. I know for me it's been incredible, but I can only imagine how, with your experience, how helpful that's been to sort of unpack these concepts.
Well, how about you? At any point, did you feel like you had denial or do you feel like you were motivated by shame after how you grew up?
It's funny when you talk about people Googling you and cults come up and it's kind of like this internal panic for a second.
Mhm.
Um, that happens with me. I'm very proud of the work that I do, but when you Google my name, cults and articles and other podcasts I've done and things come up, and it's kind of a nail biter for me because I actually still know quite a few people in the group and in that community. And I would wish to serve as a safe space for them, but I do fear the assumptions. I fear kind of like what you talked about. But at the same time, it's really conflicting because it kind of is that moment of panic, perhaps even shame at times. Am I doing this right? There's a lot of like self doubt, I guess. Am I going about this the right way? That can be sort of entangled in shame for me. There's a lot of sort of self analysis, self critiquing that happens with these projects and with what I've kind of become known for and what you've also become known for, right?
Yeah.
But I also have that fear of being misunderstood in so many ways. Or if somebody listens to me doing a podcast and selects a clip, that clip alone is the full accounting of my entire story.
Mm.
When we are very complex people. In every interview I've done, I've probably mentioned something different, something that I perhaps hadn't thought about before. And so I do worry about these things. I think about these things. I mean, in terms of during my time in the group, I certainly felt shame. As someone who was queer, I was certainly like a problem to be solved. Perspective of the group, I couldn't exist without being straight. And so, of course, there was like this shame in that way of like, I was ashamed to be myself. I was ashamed to be my true self. And now that I have the freedom to do that and be that, I see the contrast in who I am and how much I'm thriving now, even with self expression versus then. Even just looking at pictures of myself, I look back and I say, this just makes me so sad. I know how much shame I was feeling looking at these old photos of me, and I feel shame about that, even though a lot of it was out of my control. I so wish that the Ashlen then could have been the Ashlen that I'm now.
Oh, I agree regarding myself.
Yeah,
I wish I could go back and be like, okay,
yeah,
this isn't normal, or like, actually, your reaction was pretty rational to this strange situation, or whatever. I
sure.
wish I could go back.
So I feel like there's sort of these dueling images of myself. And I feel like when I've talked to people who've left groups, this can be common, where you see photos of yourself in the group and I feel sorry for that kid. I want to tell that kid that it's going to be okay. But it's also like, I also get frustrated at myself, even though I was born and raised in that group. I didn't necessarily have a choice. I was just doing everything that I was taught to do. But because I was so different now than I was then, that's sort of this really weird reconciliation, and that can bring a bunch of emotions up. And I think shame is one of those for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you. This was good. It was definitely weird to talk about myself. I'm not. I like hearing about other people more than I like talking about myself. So this is always kind of an uncomfortable space for me. But I thought it might be necessary. So thank you for doing this with me and interviewing me.
Well, thank you, Dhyana. It is never easy to be on that side of the microphone, and I feel very honored to have done this with you. And I just really thank you for sharing what you have, because I know it will make a difference, and it has made a difference, and we're seeing the fruits of that with Generation Holt. So thank you for the work you do.
Thanks.
So that's the show for today. Thank you for listening to me talk about myself. And a big thank you to Ashlen for interviewing me. You will be hearing more from her. Come back. On the next episode, we'll be chatting with someone who grew up in a Bible-based weight loss group. The organization was featured in a recent HBO Max docuseries called The Way Down, and I'm going to be interviewing someone who spent her youth in the group. The show is produced by me, Dhyana Levey, and hosted this episode by Ashlen Hilliard, with original music by Leanne Dunn, and opening and closing music, which you're hearing right now, by the band The Chaw.